All right, folks, the Trump administration is bringing the war on terror to America. And in a pretty frightening way, journalist Ken Klippenstein, who got a leak from our intelligence agency, just detailed in his latest Substack how the Trump administration is bringing the war on terror home. We are going to talk with Ken at the end of this video. We've got a good interview with him that we just recorded today. That's 20 minutes long, but a little bit of background first. So, the Trump administration last month basically implemented this new national security directive called NSPM 7 to go after basically any dissent of the Trump administration as terrorism, as political violence. They characterize things like anti Christian beliefs, anti Americanism, anti traditional values as worthy of terrorism, and they need to go after, in the name of national security, DHS, FBI, the intelligence agencies, ICE. They need to go after dissent in America. And Ken's new reporting, here's the actual article, quote, ICE National Guard deployments, just the beginning. Upcoming national security strategy makes Homeland the top priority. In that piece, he talks about how NSPM 7 is now being put together in this whole of government approach to go after anybody who really disagrees with the Trump administration. So here are some of the things about NSPM 7 before we get into the interview that you should probably know. Here's from Ken, quote, Trump has signed a little notice national security directive identifying anti-Christian and anti-American views as indicators of radical left violence. Called National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, it is being referred to as NSPM 7 by administration insiders. And what Stephen Miller, Trump's sycophantic advisor, is saying about this is, quote, this is the first time in American history that there is an all-of-government effort to dismantle left-wing terrorism. The Trump administration and Stephen Miller are basically recharacterizing any dissent against the administration, against this regime, as terrorism, and using a whole-of-government approach to go after this dissent. And they're also using ICE to do this. ICE is now, with its $170 billion budget increase that it just got from the big, beautiful bill, going out and buying technologies that can hack into your phones, recognize your face, track your location, usurp our First and Fourth Amendments in this whole of government approach to go after, quote unquote, terrorism, which is really just any dissent to the regime. I want to play you this interview with Ken. Ken has done an incredible job at really all the reporting in the national security space. He's probably the #1 national security reporter in America, and he's brought this reporting to light. It's incredibly underreported. So here's this whole thing. So I have with me now Ken Klippenstein, who actually broke the story on NSPM 7 and then this new strategy that the Trump administration is implementing. Ken, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, good to talk to you, Justin.
So I guess my first question is, you called this NSPM 7 a blueprint for, quote, bringing the war home. So for people who haven't read the memo or this new reporting on the national security strategy that the Trump administration is about to finalize, what's the single most important thing that they need to understand about it?
That the war on terror is being updated, revamped, and it's now focused on the continental United States and the area around it. What was once a war in the Middle East, in far-flung countries, is, as you said, coming home, and is something that should concern anyone who lives in or around the United States, which I imagine is everyone or most of the people watching this.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was actually going to ask, is this basically a new domestic war on terror, but instead pointed inward this time? NSPM 7 redefines different radicalization or radical activities to include anti-Christian or anti-American views. It targets things like civil disorder, which are generally pretty vague. How unusual is it for ideology to be explicitly targeted like this, anti-Christian, anti-American, and two, for this vague characterization of terrorist or disruptive activities like civil disorder?
This is literally the first time I have ever seen something like this. And I think that is part of the reason that the media has done such a poor job of covering it, not the independent press, which has been great, social media platforms and people with social media shows like yours, they've been really good about it. But I think part of the reason is that just reading the NSPM7 document, I encourage people to go and I publish that in my newsletter. You can actually look at the language itself. It's not secret. Just makes you sound so Alex Jones that it's hard for people to take seriously. Like, this can't be real, because as you said, anti-Christian sentiment, that's a direct quote that is included in NSPM7 and is identified as what's called an indicator of future terrorist acts. So as crazy as that sounds, that is verbatim from the document, and I don't know how else to say it other than just that's what it is. There's no editorializing going on here. That's literally what it is that they're doing. And what that does in effect is it makes everyone who isn't MAGA a target. At first, when I looked at it, I thought, oh, this is making the left a target. And then I realized, wait, anti-Christian, anti-traditional family, this is like beyond that even. If you're Hindu,
Right.
if you're Jewish, if you're, whatever, in critical of Christianity.
If you're anybody against the current administration, basically.
Pretty much, yeah.
Pre-crime and preemption. You talked a little bit about this in your Substack, where you broke the NSPM7 story, how the memo basically orders agencies to disrupt people, quote, before they result in violent political acts. I guess broadly, how does a democracy define pre-crime, and who decides what before the act means? And in some ways, does NSPM7 give legal cover for mass surveillance then, since preemptive action requires constant monitoring?
Essentially, yeah. Preemption is core to the counterterrorism strategy, and that is a big part of the reason that counterterrorism has been focused on really dangerous groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because it's understood to be such a threat to civil liberties that it can't be tolerated in large part in a free society. And this is something that has to be reserved for just the worst of the worst. Even some civil libertarians, and I'm sympathetic to this argument, say that it shouldn't be used at all, and the traditional crime fighting approach should be used instead, just because of how corrosive it is to a free society. But in any case, they are taking that and they're not applying it to ISIS anymore. They're applying it to these left-wing groups that you can find cases of, civil unrest, broken windows, destruction of Tesla vehicles, all sorts of things that I think should be charged criminally, but which don't pose anything near the threat that something like an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS does. I mean, when you talk about groups like that, the theory is we are going to suspend some amount of the freedoms that we take for granted here in the West, because the threat of a dirty bomb or, God forbid, a nuclear small weapon of mass destruction going off is just so frightening that we have to suspend these things. And so that is core to counterterrorism in general. But what's unique about this is it's now being applied to groups that are Americans, domestic groups, rather than foreign groups.
Right. And specifically Antifa, which the administration has described in the past as an organized threat, now actually a terrorist organization. The FBI director called it an ideology, not a group. So from your reporting, does this classification as Antifa basically, is it being used as kind of like a catch-all for left-wing dissent in general, and to be able to treat left-wing dissent as a threat on the level of Al-Qaeda or a terrorist group like that?
Yeah, because even if you don't consider yourself, quote, Antifa, and there really is no such formal group as far as I can tell, it is a catch-all, because when you look at NSPM7, the actual directive that President Trump signed and released, it defines these groups as anti-ICE, having what the Trump administration considers, quote, something like extreme views on immigration, which is ironic in itself. A lot of people would say the Trump administration has extreme views on immigration, but so much of this is a matter of opinion and personal subjective judgment that you're exactly right. It doesn't matter if you call yourself Antifa, because the way in which they go about defining it is all of these categories that we've been describing before, which it seems to me can be applied to just about anyone who isn't MAGA.
Right. Now, NSPM 7 orders DHS, the Pentagon, DOJ, basically the intel community at large to coordinate. You were pretty specific to say this was a national security directive, not an executive order, which a ton of mainstream media was saying was an executive order. Are we basically watching the real-time creation of a unified domestic intelligence architecture?
That's a very good way of putting it, because it's not just Pam Bondi and the Justice Department. It's not just the FBI. It's not just ICE. It is the entirety of the federal government being told that this is your new priority set. This is how you're going to get promotions. This is where our budget is going to go towards. You need to focus on this for the remainder of the administration, and you need to coordinate on it. You need to share intelligence. You need to create task forces as they're doing. We're all going to work together on this priority, just like we did Al Qaeda after 9/11, but now the target is Antifa. So that's really what's key to that. NSPM stands for National Security Presidential Memorandum. That is distinct from an executive order in that that is a big picture strategy document that tells them from a kind of 10,000 foot view, here's everything we're going to be focused on for the next 3 years. So it's basically, it's like an executive order on steroids, in the sense that an executive order often is kind of concerns the day-to-day operations of what the federal government does. It's much smaller. Just to give you one example, there have been over 200 executive orders by President Trump doing things like removing transgenderism from government documents, which is of course significant, but that's much more micro in focus than a national security memorandum. In fact, there's only been 7. That's why it's called NSPM 7, far fewer than the 200 plus executive orders. And oftentimes in the past, they were classified. We don't know why he made this one public. NSPM 6 is classified. We don't know what it is. But for whatever reason, he chose to make this public. And because of that, we know what it is. But usually it has a high degree of secrecy around it because of the importance and the involvement of the intelligence community and all these other things. So that gives you a sense of how important something like this is above and beyond the usual executive orders.
Right. And on the topic of intelligence agencies coordinating, we're seeing ICE, which is an immigration agency, suddenly buying phone hacking spyware, iris scanners, real-time location tracking. They just got this $170 billion infusion. Are they coordinating with ICE to help build this surveillance infrastructure and kind of turning ICE into a domestic intelligence agency?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people don't know this, but ICE contains 2 major components within it. One is called Homeland Security Investigations, which is basically ICE's own in-house FBI, their own investigative division. And they have thousands of members. And not to mention, the Trump administration just more than doubled ICE's law enforcement budget going forward. So they basically have had a just tsunami of cash infusion power. And when you look at NSPM 7 and a subsequent order by Attorney General Pam Bondi, a lot of this is framed around creating, as Bondi's order did, an ICE protection task force. That phrase actually appears in her order. You can go and look that up on the Justice Department website. When the National Guard is being deployed to places like Chicago, the core of their mission is supposed to be, quote, protecting ICE. And so the idea, the legal argument that the Trump administration has advanced is that these protests against ICE pose a threat to their personnel. And for that reason, to protect ongoing federal government operations, the military is necessary. These FBI deployments are necessary. All of these resources are necessary to protect federal government property and personnel. So that is core to the entire approach of the administration. I think that when we see coverage of a lot of these Guard deployments, a lot of the ICE deployments, what's missing is exactly what we're talking about here. Is what is there is a grand strategy to this. It's not just Trump flailing around crazily, although he can, it looks very chaotic. The unified field theory of this, and I do believe that the administration believes this, which I was surprised to learn over the course of my reporting, they really think they're under attack. Charlie Kirk's murder was received by people in the administration kind of as their 9/11. And so they feel as though they're protecting themselves from the next, version of the plane slamming into the trade towers, which in this case is the next killing of a prominent conservative like Charlie Kirk, who was known on a personal level to basically everyone in the administration. As I talked to people close to the administration, I quickly got the impression from people in the national security bureaucracy, they are genuinely scared and they are lashing out as a consequence of that. And that is part of the reason that you are seeing this escalation above and beyond what we saw, not just in Trump's first administration, but even in the beginning of this second administration.
And what you just said, something that's above and beyond what it originally started as. You've been covering DHS and national security for years. We know that agencies and directives often, push beyond their original scope and intent. What prevents NSPM 7 from expanding into something much broader than advertised? And it's already pretty broad.
Well, fortunately, in the case of legal charges, ultimately the jury has to agree with them. And we're seeing case after case collapse in unprecedented fashion. I mean, you yourself have a legal background, and so you understand how uncommon it is for when the federal government files charges and they can't even get an indictment. Not only is that embarrassing, it's alarming because they're running with evidence that can't even pass the first legal hurdle. You know, the saying, you can indict a ham sandwich. It is very easy to secure a grand jury indictment. That's like the first step to criminal process. If they can't even do that, that shows you how cavalier they're being about the charges that they're filing around a lot of these kind of things. I did one story on someone who was arrested, detained, interrogated for a day and wasn't ultimately charged with anything. I did another story on someone else. That was someone in Chicago who was protesting the ICE facility, just documenting ICE operations as far as we know, in Broadview, Illinois, Chicago area. In another case, I interviewed a young man who protested at an ICE facility in Arizona. And then when he returned home a couple of days later, he got a visit from the FBI. They had a series of questions for him. We're trying to clearly map out the identities of other people who had attended, and never charged with any crime. So even though I'm of two minds on this, one is that some of the worst things are being prevented by juries just looking at this and saying, this is outrageous. I can't charge this. But at the same time, those visits and these charges can have a chilling effect on speech, which in the case I just mentioned, when I asked that young man what his takeaway was from the FBI visiting, he wanted to go to the No Kings protest and decided not to do it because he was just freaked out by the entire experience. That is what we have to worry about, at least for right now. Is this going to scare people from participating in their First Amendment protected rights to assembly and speech because of all these outrageous things that maybe won't get you a prison sentence, but getting interrogated for a day, that's no fun. You know, we have to be realistic about this. Like, even if you don't actually go to jail, that doesn't mean that it's not extremely unpleasant to get a visit from the FBI or embarrassing to your neighbors or, whatever the set of concerns are. That's really alarming. So the question yet is how much farther they're going to push it than that. And we honestly don't know the question yet because there's so many variables. Just to give you one data point, FBI Director Kash Patel testified recently that there's been, I think he said a 200% or 200% increase in domestic terrorism investigations. So they are undertaking this. We don't know what the charges will ultimately be, but they're throwing everything against the wall. We're going to see what sticks, but there's no question that they're going all in on this. And the very glib response by major media to say, oh, there's no law they can charge them with, completely misunderstands the problem we're looking at here. Because even if you're not ultimately decided by a jury to have committed a crime, that doesn't mean they can't make your life a headache in all kinds of other ways.
Right. What kinds of people or groups, and you just talked about this a little bit, people who have gone and protested ICE and they've tried to bring the weight of the federal government against and been unsuccessful. What kinds of groups or people do you think are most likely to be affected by NSPM 7 enforcement? And do lawmakers on either side of the aisle fully understand or appreciate this directive? Or are the implications still kind of invisible to most of Congress?
National security is not easy to understand, and so I have some sympathy around that. I do think that the people on the National Security Committee should understand it, and unfortunately, they tend to go along with what I was describing before. A lot of these major media errors saying, "Oh, someone." I mean, they had a former DOJ person, I think, on MSNBC recently saying, "Well, no jury's gonna charge something like this." Just completely missing the point of having your name splashed across the Department of Homeland Security website next to the word terrorism. Who wants that? Most people have to work a job where their boss is going to see that and say, I don't want to hire this guy or somebody that they're looking to work for. So there's all kinds of things short of a formal prison sentence that can deter people. And what it's being wielded against, to your question about who has to worry about this, the main focus that we've seen so far is the anti-ICE protests, which is really alarming because that is something that is a widely held position. I mean, one of the things critical of the Trump administration that polls best in the United States is opposition to the way in which his immigration enforcement agenda has been rolled out. And so this is the idea that this is just some guy with purple hair who's an anarchist. That's really not what we've seen to be the case with NSPM 7 and the role. These are just by and large people that went to protest in front of ICE facilities, which could be anyone who would do that. It goes far beyond just the notion that it's people breaking windows or kind of the punk aesthetic,
Right.
that the Trump administration has kind of tried to message is the focus. This is solidly within the mainstream. I mean, when you look at who Trump is saying they're going to use the Treasury Department to go after, the Open Society Foundation, and I mean, these are very mainstream liberal groups.
Right.
Whatever you think of them, this is not some like niche, small like activist clique. Like this is something that has millions of members. And so, yeah, I really want to stress how much this is targeted at ordinary people.
Would you say it's safe to characterize this as a broad but coordinated effort to throw the weight of the federal government against Donald Trump's opponents?
Oh, totally. Again, just we don't even have to interpret that. Go and read NSPM 7 and tell me that that's not what you take away from it. It's not just anti-Christian, it's anti-capitalist, anti-traditional family. I mean, how would you define this other than just not Trump? Because again,
Right.
Anti-traditional family, that could be like bachelors, it's not, this isn't even
It's crazy.
left wing. Like this is just anything that doesn't fit his picture.
It's genuinely chilling and it's insane. Ken, you for years have broken a number of stories, primarily in the national security apparatus and reporting on national security. It's kind of your specialty, what you're known for. Is it getting harder for journalists like you to report on national security when these policies actually being put in place, like NSPM 7 and this broad strategy that you talked about in your most recent Substack, are increasingly targeting domestic people? Do you feel like it's more difficult to get intel from your sources in the intelligence agencies? And do you feel like you are at risk at all from being targeted?
I'm more worried about my sources because many of them are subject to polygraphs, which the Trump administration has been extremely aggressive in applying to personnel in the intelligence community to try to tamp down leaks. It's kind of a complicated picture because a lot of folks in these agencies, I might not agree with politically, but they have integrity. People that talk to me care that something wrong is being done, and that motivates them to want to talk to me. But at the same time, you have this culture of fear that exists, and which the Trump administration is trying to cultivate in people by advertising. We're really going to get these leakers. We're going to find you, and we're going to nail you to the wall when we catch you. So it's a kind of mixed picture. I would say it's generally harder. I mean, it was never easy doing national security reporting, not just because of the leak indictments by Justice Departments, both Democrat and Republican, but it's even worse now because of the environment in which they're talking about. Once they're casting enemies as counterterrorism, that opens up a suite of investigative tools that they can use to try to look at things that I think is widely understood to mean we're being watched more than we were before. And not just that, outside of government, when I try to interview a lot of these protesters, because they have public defenders and counsel, they're told not to talk to the press, which isn't bad advice to give somebody, but it has the aggregate effect of depriving from the public information about what exactly is happening. So we don't really know a lot of these cases of people that are interrogated by federal law enforcement because they're probably listening to their lawyers. And in fact, I can, have had the personal experience of going to people and them saying, I really wish I could talk because there is newsworthy information here and what you're describing is real. And I experienced something bad, but my attorney says I can't talk about it. And I've had that experience with like half a dozen people now. And I'm just one guy trying to go out and contact people. This is going on all over the country. The only times that we find out about it are either when it's mentioned in a criminal complaint from the Justice Department, or somebody has the integrity to come forward and talk about it, or courage to do so against the advice of counsel or the general advice not to talk about law enforcement proceedings. So the public is really at an information disadvantage here. When the stuff I write about, that's just what I was able to find. I think it's really just the tip of the iceberg.
And I know you're short on time, so I'll ask you one last question. In your view, is NSPM 7 the most important national security story of this administration? And if so, why?
No question. I would point to the fact that that is not just my opinion. Congressman from California, Ro Khanna, who started his career in opposition to the Patriot Act of the Bush administration in the 2000s, said that this is the biggest attack on civil liberties since the Patriot Act. And I think he's exactly right. Because what it does is, as we were talking about before, targets speech and what's supposed to be First Amendment protected conduct under the belief that this is going to help you anticipate future crimes which have not been committed. And so, that might be a core part of the counterterrorism approach, but to apply that to Americans in cases in which some of the worst that you can find are property destruction, it's just wildly out of proportion to the purported threat. And we are already seeing it have a chilling effect on demonstrators. I mean, I mentioned one who said he didn't want to go to protests. There are no doubt thousands of people across the country that look at these things and think, gee, I don't want to get wrapped up in this. And that is a tragic loss for, I think, our political system of democracy, which is based on the idea that you can go out and press your demands and make your views heard, whatever your political views are. It's a real shame and it's alarming. And I hope that the media gets around to understanding the effect that it has on those First Amendment rights, short of the entire question of, facing the criminal justice system. And I'm glad that you gave me the opportunity to kind of lay that out here.
Well, thanks again for coming on and joining us, Ken. For everybody who doesn't know, Ken Klippenstein on Substack, that's Ken and Klippenstein with a K. Thanks again and hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Justin. It's great to talk to you.
Likewise.